All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. I see some new faces here at the Stoa. So if this is the first time joining us, I don't really know how to describe the place. Sometimes I call it a communal podcast, but we also do non-recorded wisdom gym sessions where we have embodiment, meditation, breathwork sessions, collective journaling, Quaker-esque collective presencing, basically practices oriented to remind us that of our innate wholeness. So I'll put some links in the chat in a moment. And as you can see from our upcoming sessions, there's a bunch of weird and pretentious titles that we have, things like marketing for hippies, collapsed lifeboats, resiliency, neighborhoods, and non-duality. So you can check out the YouTube channel as well. We have over 600 philosophically rich lectures you can check out. And today I'm so super excited because we have Clementine and Jay of the Fucking Canceled podcast joining us. And one of the aims of the Fucking Canceled podcast is to address and critique the phenomenon they call the Nexus, synthesis of identitarianism, social media, and cancel culture. And when the term cancel culture comes up, many people think about like critiques that come from the political right, but there's a lot of really good critiques coming up from the left. Loretta Ross, who's previously on the Stoa, calls it advocates for a call-in culture. Ben Burgess, who was on the Stoa last year, discussed his book, Canceling Comedians When the World Burns. And Clementine and Jay, I think, have one of the better, if not best, critiques I've seen from either the right or the left of cancel culture. So how today's going to work, they're going to, all three of us are going to have an exchange, and then we'll pivot to a Q&A. So if you have questions anytime, just pop them in the chat. And I'll call on you. And if you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that and I'll ask your question on your behalf. Yeah, without further ado, welcome to the Stoa. And perhaps we can open up just maybe any introduction you would like to give on yourself or the podcast, and then we can go from there. And can you unmute yourself? Oh, you can't. Okay. So the muting bondage is now over. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us. We're happy to be here.
Yeah, we're happy to be here.
Yeah, I guess we often talk about the story of a couple of years ago when we were both sort of like deprogramming from what we call the Nexus. We spent a lot of time walking around Montreal and in the COVID lockdowns, with nothing to do and nowhere to go, walking around for hours talking about what was going on and what we thought about things. And then at a certain point we were like, we should probably just record this because we were coming up with a lot of good content. So we ended up doing that, and that's kind of the genesis of the Fucking Cancel podcast.
Yeah, it definitely also coincided with my cancellation. So that was also going on in early COVID days, and it was a dramatic time. And so we spent a lot of time talking about it and then decided that other people might want to hear us talk about it too.
And as I mentioned to you before we let people in, I emailed people in advance questions that they might have for the session, and some of them were like heartbreaking, the stories and questions around cancel culture. I'm sure we'll get into how to address that. And so the topic of the title is this Nexus, which is a term I think you both coined. So maybe a high-level 101 on the three components, identitarianism, social media, and cancel culture, and how they're connected.
Sure. So basically, the thing about the Nexus is like it needs a name. It's a phenomenon that doesn't really have a name. And most people who are inside this culture know what it is. Sometimes, it's been called like social justice culture. Sometimes people call it like woke culture, but like none of those things really sum up what it actually is. Like they all kind of fall short. And most of the people who are inside of that culture, they don't actually name that they're practicing some kind of ideology or some kind of specific. They don't position themselves anywhere. It's just that this is like the correct or like the morally right way or the political like way of doing things, right? And so we wanted a way of talking about it. So we kind of just use Nexus as a placeholder because we were talking about how it's like a nexus of these three components, and what happens when they come together and like what comes out of the three things together. So I guess we can talk about each one. Do you want to like pick one and then?
Yeah, sure. So like Clementine said, and like you mentioned, we think of this culture, this phenomenon that we call the Nexus as being, like a synthesis or a combination of these three components, right? Identitarianism, cancel culture, and social media. And we kind of analyze the way that they interact with each other to create a kind of fourth new thing. And yeah, the first phenomenon or the first component of the nexus that we talk about a lot is identitarianism. So we distinguish that from identity politics. I mean, identity politics is what a lot of people will call this, but I think that there's a good case to be made that identity politics is just sort of any political idea or practice that centers identity. And identity is important. It's been important. It's not going to stop being important. So it would be ridiculous to kind of say that we never want any form of identity politics. But identitarianism is a sort of obsessive centering of identity at the expense of practically every other consideration, in particular, the economy and class, right? And within identitarianism, there's a sort of, there's this thing that takes place where there's a kind of like deference that people are sort of forced into, or, if you're sort of a willing participant, that you are willing to do based on the identities of like interlocutors. So I guess what that means in practice is that people can be sort of categorized by their identities, and then whether or not you agree with what they're saying has to do more with their identity than what they're actually saying,
Yeah.
And this is like something that we see a lot in identitarianism, except that it's selective. And by that, I mean that if, let's say, someone is like queer, and that queer person says something that goes against identitarian logic, that person will not be sort of like deferred to, right? But if they say something that goes along with identitarian logic, then they will be.
Yeah, so like this is connected to the concept of essentialism, right? And the idea that there is such a thing as a queer perspective or a women's perspective or a BIPOC perspective, that there is such a thing as a coherent perspective that could be attributed to any kind of identity group, right? All identity groups are made up of large numbers of people, sometimes millions, sometimes billions of people, and each of those people has, diverse and differing opinions. And if you look closely at any identity group, you will see like vast disagreement and histories of disagreement. There is no coherent voice, right? But the nexus using identitarianism acts as if there is. And so like what Jay is saying about how it's like we have to defer to identity unless the person of that identity is saying something dissenting from the nexus, right? And then in that case, it's actually their identity that comes into question rather than the argument being held up. I'm not sure if that makes sense. But basically, you will see things like there are like racialized scholars who are pushing back against like the type of anti-racism that comes out of the nexus. And then people will say that those people have like internalized white supremacy, even if they are like articulate socialists who are offering a different way of understanding race and racism. It will just be dismissed, and it's actually their like identity that is coming into question, like their right to speak as a racialized person, right? So that's an important component of it.
Yeah, this is kind of like selective essentialism. And, identitarianism is based heavily on privilege theory, like intersectional privilege theory, the idea that people can kind of be categorized based on their identities, and it puts them in like a hierarchy of privilege, and that's one of the most important ways of looking at the world. And yeah, its role within the nexus, the role of identitarianism within the nexus is to kind of create content. Like a lot of like what happens within the nexus is just kind of like people thinking about the world through an identitarian lens, right? The next component of the nexus is cancel culture, obviously, in the name of our podcast, and yeah, cancel culture is like these, I think that we all kind of know what it is, but yeah, it's these targeted campaigns of harassment against individuals, sometimes against organizations too, and that coincide with a kind of like social exiling.
Yeah. And so I guess like what's important with cancel culture is just that like it's a process of dehumanization. A person is marked. And when they are marked, any empathy with that person is no longer allowed. And this is like really essential. So like cruelty, mockery, contempt, things that in general would not be considered acceptable are suddenly allowed when it comes to a person who's been marked, because they are now seen as a bad person and therefore like basically outside of humanity. And we are not encouraged or allowed to empathize with them.
And there's this aspect of contagion that goes along with it too, which is that like, people who have been marked in this way, anyone who's kind of associated with them, who continues to be publicly associated with them, can then become marked themselves, right? And this can like have this effect where like a chain of people will sort of be marked for just associating with one another.
Yeah, like in a concrete way, people will slide into your DMs and be like, why are you following this person? Or why are you friends with this person? And basically demand that you hold them accountable. Otherwise, you yourself risk harassment and you yourself risk being marked. And then like, finally, like what we're describing is like a cancellation campaign when a person is marked and harassed and their material security and their social belonging is attacked. That's a cancellation campaign. But cancel culture is the culture in which these campaigns happen. And so cancel culture affects not just the people who are being canceled, but everybody around who is witnessing, because it has the effect of making people very afraid to be honest, to think critically, to have their own opinions, to have their own free associations with people, because it's basically like a hypervigilant concern with, will I be canceled if I do this, right? And so it creates this like culture of fear in general, above and beyond the impact that it has on the people being canceled themselves.
Yeah, and so its role within the Nexus is kind of like this enforcer or like policing role, right? And then finally, social media, right? Social media is where most of this takes place. It's the kind of like medium in which the Nexus exists, you know? And it has these effects on the Nexus because it like forms its you know, it's kind of it's medium, right? So there's this aspect of virality, like things can go viral on social media in a way that they can't really in just sort of like everyday life, right? And so, you know, let's say you're just in like a community of people in like a pre-internet kind of community, let's say like a punk scene or like a socialist group or something like that, and you become sort of scapegoated for some reason. It is very, very unlikely that would follow you really anywhere outside of that like group of people who are involved, right? On the other hand, with social media, totally random people can can sort of like accidentally have their cancellations go like extremely viral, and they can be spread to, you know, thousands or hundreds of thousands, sometimes in really insane cases like millions of people, right? Because as soon as like a heavy hitter Instagram influencer or something like that starts like sharing it, then all of a sudden it can be viewed by like enormous numbers of people.
Yeah, one of the things that I say about this is that like I feel like celebrity culture, you know, that there was this idea for a long time that like celebrities, they got millions or billions of dollars, and then like as a trade-off we dehumanize them, meaning that like we get to consume their lives as entertainment and like, you know, put them in tabloids and stuff like that, but they get to be really rich. So like I guess it's a fair trade. But with social media, now we treat regular people like celebrities, and we have this extreme entitlement to like the details of their lives and to like following what's going on with them. And we consider having like a couple thousand, you know, Instagram followers as like having a really big platform. And now this person is a public figure. And sometimes this extends to people who really don't even have a very large platform at all, but they're being treated basically like a celebrity, but they're not rich. And this is something that I think is really, really important, because when people are talking about like, you know, social media and power and being a public figure and all of this, there's very little acknowledgement of the fact that most of the people being canceled literally are not rich and they're just regular working people.
Yeah. Also, social media encourages this like surveillance, right? Like everything you put up stays up, you know, everything that, you know, it means that people can sort of like watch each other and keep tabs on each other, which is this this component that's really important for, you know, the whole phenomenon of cancellation.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like we've gone on for a really long time, so I feel like that probably covers it. Is there anything else that you really want to say?
That pretty much sums up the three components.
Yeah.
And what I really like about that, it's like almost like three critiques, like a propositional critique, a cultural critique, and a structural critique. Or like the propositional critique is like you're focused on the argument space, and then the cultural critique is like focused on the maladaptive responses to like real trauma, and then the structural critique is like the container, like Twitter or Instagram, that's like, you know, situating the profit motive. So I think that's why like three seems needed. And so I'm curious what you think of that framing. And the question to tease out there is, which one like onboards people best to the Nexus argument, like out of the three?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Like what out of those three facets of the Nexus, which one like onboards people to be sympathetic with it or understand it or grok it or whatever?
To be sympathetic with the Nexus, you mean?
No, with our like
or with
arguments.
us.
With your argument.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess like one thing I want to say about this is that what ends up happening, is that I think that people can be critical of one component, but they want to hold on to a different component, and so that's at least what I find, is that I think that there's a lot of people inside the Nexus who are starting to become critical of cancel culture because they see it, like they live in fear of it. They're like terrified of it. They know people who have been canceled, or they've been canceled, or they just like have obsessive thinking and hypervigilance about being canceled, but they have a harder time with the critique of identitarianism. And I think that the reason for this is because I think that, rightly so, people are very concerned with not wanting to, dehumanize people or hold up systems like racism, like sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, et cetera, right? And so people they don't like those things, and they don't want to do that, and that's good. I'm glad that they feel that way. But what that ends up doing is it makes people, and it's actually a function of identitarianism in the Nexus, because if in identitarianism, the way that it works is that you're not allowed to think carefully about certain topics unless you are of a certain identity, right? So like a straight person doesn't feel like they're allowed to have an opinion on homophobia. A white person is not allowed to have an opinion on racism. But like what this means is it's basically outsourcing your integrity. It's not actually thinking carefully and deeply, and also like looking widely at what different people across the board are saying about these things. And so it ends up, unfortunately, actually reproducing the very thing that these people don't want to be doing, because they don't want to dehumanize people, and yet they're relating to people in a very essentialist way, where they're basically asking random people to stand in as like a representative for their identity group, and they're actually outsourcing their own integrity about, forming an opinion on a certain matter, right?
Yeah, and further, like one of the things that the Nexus does is, sorry, this isn't really an answer to your question, but I'm just riffing on what Clementine's saying. Like one of the things that the Nexus does is, and this is why we need a name for it that we had to come up with, is it doesn't name itself, it just presents itself as this like neutral kind of background, like ideology, or not even an ideology, just a sort of the right way of doing things. So the people within it don't even understand that there are ways of thinking about things outside of it. They understand that there's a sort of like evil, like right-wing way of thinking about things, but they don't understand that there are like many and multiple left-wing critiques of what they believe, right? And those left-wing critiques are basically sort of like exiled from within the Nexus. And part of the role of cancellation and cancel culture is to sort of like act as almost like an immune system, so that like when those left-wing critiques of the Nexus are made, they're sort of instantly like pushed out, right? Like people making them can be canceled and marked, but also like the kinds of like platforms on which they appear are just never present within the sort of like social world of the Nexus.
Yeah, and I think that, in the left more broadly, there has started to be more critiques of this stuff. There has started to be like, the phenomenon of like the dirtbag left, for example. There's this sort of like there's this leftist critique that is returning more to an economic analysis, that has more of a critique of like the excesses of identitarian cancel culture, et cetera. But the thing is that most of the people who are in that kind of cultural world are not inside the Nexus and never have been, and so I think that they partially don't understand fully what's going on in there, and also they don't know how to speak in a way that Nexans relate to, because Jay and I are queer, and like we understand, because we have been inside the culture for so long, that like I think that we bring a little something different to the critique of it, because we aren't critiquing it from outside, we're critiquing it from inside. And like unfortunately, I think sometimes, obviously like the right wing has its own critique that can be like very transphobic, or like very homophobic, or very, hateful in various ways. But even sometimes leftists, in their attempts to sort of like make fun of the excesses of the Nexus, can also like say things that can be like jabs at like queer people and stuff like that, So we're always just pointing out that we're like extremely within that culture, and we're not saying that we have to get rid of like, they, them pronouns, polyamory, vocal fry, all of these things. That's fine. We can have our culture, but we want to do so without attacking each other, and we want to do so in a way where we're free to like think critically and broadly.
What's coming up? I've written about I'll put in the chat, kind of a culture war before, from like a meta perspective. And I don't really like the left, even though I think it's valid, like the left and right kind of polarization. But I view like mimetic tribes. And Stoa is an interesting place because it's almost like refugees of like mimetic tribes, whether from like woke or the heterodox, they kind of find their way here. And I noticed a through line that anyone who engages in trauma work, psychotherapy, has like a shame literacy or embodiment. It's just like they have fatigue with culture war and they just don't vibe with the Nexus. And so this maps over sort of your work with trauma. So I'm curious if you can speak on that, if anything's coming up there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, a big component of our critique actually comes from our background in 12-step groups. Both of us are sober. We've both been sober for about a decade, and we got sober in 12-step groups. And, you know, one thing that I think both of us experienced was that the more recovered we got, the less possible it was for us to remain in the Nexus. It just started to become so blindingly obvious that like it was completely opposed to the kinds of principles that we were trying to cultivate in 12-step groups that we needed to cultivate in order to stay sober and happy, you know. There's a bunch of very like sort of clear examples. Like one thing is that, you know, in 12-step groups, like it really, really, really does not matter what you've done. It does not matter what you've done. You're welcome there. And you can have done like horrible shit. You can be a murderer who got out of jail, whatever, and people will shake your hand and invite you to have coffee with them and invite you back, you know, and give you their phone number, right, and be like, call me anytime. And the way in which like we noticed that like that kind of like extremely open and extremely like non-judgmental attitude was actually like crucial for creating these like communities that we were getting sober in, you know, that conflicted so strongly with the way that the Nexus treats practically everyone as completely disposable. Not practically everyone as completely disposable, right? It's like if you make errors, or even if you're just accused of making errors that you didn't even make, you are just deleted from the social world, you know. And that kind of like that like trigger happy willingness to just sort of like erase people is completely at odds with 12-step groups. And I mean, that's just one example. I'm sure Clementine has more.
Yeah. Another thing that comes to mind for me is basically like the concept of like codependency, if you want to call it that. Just the idea of boundaries and like what's mine and what's yours, you know, and like what can we be responsible for and what we can't be responsible for. And one of the things that it's a story I share often is just that, like, you know, in 12 steps, we have a process where we write down everything that we've ever done wrong in our lives, and we share that with our sponsor, you know. And the first time that I went through the 12 steps, I wrote down basically every example of someone being mad at me, you know, and some of those were things that I had done wrong, and some of those were just people being mad at me, and I hadn't actually done anything wrong, right? And so my sponsor went through this process of discernment with me, basically getting me to cross off the things where she's like, okay, but like, is that actually something wrong? Like, did you violate this person's boundaries? Were you acting outside of your integrity in any way? Or is that just this person being upset with you, you know? And so by the time like I was canceled, like I was already so aware of like what we call my side of the street versus your side of the street, you know, and not taking responsibility for other people's side of the street. And so much of what goes on in cancel culture is people having extremely like disproportionate nervous system reactions, and then basically making some other person entirely responsible for it, you know? And there's no space for you to be like, actually, like, I see that you're really upset, but I don't actually think that I did anything wrong. And that was like my cancellation exactly. Like I didn't do anything, you know? And then I was being made to be very responsible for these other people's extreme reactions to what they were perceiving in me. So that's a piece of it. And then I think just the last thing that I would touch on here is the shame piece. I think that shame freezes people. It sends people into like a place of like a freeze response of like not feeling like they can change or they can move forward, you know? And when I was in early sobriety, I was like, I had debilitating shame about my past. And I like really did not know how to move forward. But it is actually through like compassion and through people seeing me in my full humanity that I was actually able to actually transform. And I've seen that in so many other people, you know, like shaming people and like defining them through their worst mistakes. It either makes them totally shut down, or it makes them lash out, or it makes them like double down on it, you know. Extending grace and compassion is what creates the space for people to actually do the hard work of changing their behavior when that is what needs to happen. So
yeah, one last thing, just because I like this topic, like in 12 steps, like there's a a saying or, you know, something that you're encouraged to do, which is to look for similarities, not differences, you know, and to look for when someone is speaking at a meeting, right? Like you're supposed to be trying to listen for things that you relate to, not listening for things that you don't relate to. And because, you know, if I go into a meeting and there's, you know, somebody speaking who's just sort of like I don't know, like a wine mom, you know, who like is like quite wealthy and like whatever, it's very easy for me to be like, I have like nothing in common with this lady. My experiences are very different, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't serve me, right? Like I'm there to fucking get sober. So I have to listen to the things she's saying that I relate to, you know, and usually it's things like feelings, right? So she might be saying, you know, like when I drank, like I couldn't stop drinking, right? And so it doesn't matter that she's drinking fancy wine, like in her fancy house. Like the thing that matters is that she like couldn't stop and that she felt like despair about that or whatever, you know. And then I can relate to that, right? And that is completely at odds with this through line in the Nexus and social justice world, which is like this really strong insistence that you cannot relate to other people if they're different from you, if they're like in a different identity group, you know. Sometimes it's said very explicitly, you know, it's like a microaggression to say like, oh, like I can relate to that, you know. And it's like the opposite of solidarity. So yeah,
that's really good. It was coming up, put in the chat. We used to have a shame breakthrough bootcamp. AJ Bond, our shame educator, he's the author of Discomfortable. He has like one of the best shame literacies around. He talks a lot about this stuff, and like, you know, if you don't have a good relationship with shame, then just nasty stuff can happen. So I'll ask one more question. But if anyone has any questions anytime, just pop in the chat. We have a few already, and I'll pivot to that in a moment. But when I sense it to like the culture war right and then the culture war left, in the relationship to cancel culture, the fight or flight response comes online. And so when the culture, and then the argument here is that the cultural right, when they come across cancel culture, rightly or wrongly, they can go engage into fight mode. And then when the cultural left comes across cancel culture, like they go to flight, they hide. But then there's a new batch like Ben Burgess and yourself that are kind of like who are in the kind of pushing back. And part of this argument is informed by like my personal interactions I've had with, and people at the Stoa know that like I'm pretty philosophically and mimetically promiscuous, which is cool because encountering their individual trauma imprint triggers me in different ways. And so like affords, like being their friend affords like, you know, great opportunity for individuation. And so my friends on like the heterodox kind of conservative side, if they experience cancel culture firsthand or like secondhand through someone they like, it's almost like, it's like they get hit and they get like go into fight mode. And that's problematic because they just like lose kind of all compassion and the ability to see signal on the quote unquote other side. They just straw man the shit out of the left. And so this is why I think a left unconsciously adopting a cancel culture as a strategy is really bad because it's a way to seduce people to, you know, like get converts. And with my woke friends, it's like they're the most terrified people of cancel culture around. And it's like they're like living in fear of it. And this is why like Mark Fisher's like vampire castle, or like what I call the cancel panopticon. And when I kind of like I'm with them when those subjects come up, I feel a tightness in their body. And it's almost like they're kind of like, you know, like they're just like hiding in a way. So I'm curious if you think this is kind of like there's any signal here with this fight or flight response that maps over to the culture war left or right.
I think one issue that I take with the characterization is just that like I think that on both sides you're going to see people with both patterns, you know. And the thing is that if you see a canceller, like I'm talking a true believer canceller on a crusade, they are not having a flight response. That is a fight response, and they are coming for you. And it is very scary to be on the receiving end of that. It is not only is it pure dehumanization, you know, but it is like rage, and they are using the fear of other people, but also using people's like, you know, sincere belief in this. Sometimes they rally, right? And so it is definitely a very active and aggressive stance that many people in the Nexus on the social justice left are taking. But that being said, like we were talking about cancel culture as a culture, and it is not just the canceled and the cancelers, you know, it is all of these other people too, right? And I often divide people who participate in cancel culture into like different groups where there's like true believers, you know, who are strongly in favor of this stuff. And I read, you know, a piece that you sent me, and you said like you didn't really think that people say that they are in favor of cancel culture. I think that I read that in what you were saying, but anyway, people are saying that now. And I think it's part of the fact that the contradiction has been pushed, because there are those of us who are now saying we don't believe in cancel culture. And the pro cancel culture side always was saying, no, cancel culture doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It's just consequences. But now, because more people are being like, we actually don't like cancel culture, there's people being like, no, cancel culture does exist and it's a good thing, you know? So there are true believers. And then there's a lot of other people who, you know, are participating on some level of fear, coercion, and they're not necessarily like, you know, having a fight response in the same way that these other people are, but they're being kind of roped into it.
Yeah, I would also say, like, it's interesting because I think that when we see a flight response with regard to this stuff, to me, that's more like people who just check out and like book it and like remove themselves from the left and are just like, fuck it, like I can't cope with like how insane I feel when I engage with this stuff. Like that's like a response that I see a lot. Whereas I think that people who are really stuck in the nexus, like people like woke people and people who are just like really in it, they're more like they're stuck in a fawn response. Like 90% of the time they're just like, I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm sorry for, but I'm sorry.
Yeah,
you know,
100%.
and it's just like whenever anyone like looks at them, they're like, you know, because they, you know, and I remember like I was fucking in it, you know. It's like it's a very scary kind of like way to be. And the only kind of way that you can make it make sense in your head is to just be like, well, I basically have to like constantly and hypervigilantly figure out the ways that I can like appease anyone who might say anything about me that they can frame in a sort of convincingly identitarian way, you know?
Yeah, that feels right. Sort of like on the spectrum of fight or flight, it shows up differently with different facets with each side of the culture war. Cool. So I might have some more questions bubbling up later, but let's go to the Q&A. So someone asked me a question privately in the chat, so I'm going to read it. Okay. So anonymous question: what wisdom can you share for someone who has amends to make, yet resists making it for fear of being canceled? Another way of saying it, has cancel culture destroyed forgiveness now and forever?
Yeah, we talk about this a bit on the pod. One thing in like 12-step groups where, you know, when we talk about amends, like we're talking about the process that happens in 12-step groups. So just bear that in mind. But like one thing in 12-step groups is that like, if it's not safe for you to make amends to someone, like you're not encouraged to make amends to them, right? And so like, you know, for example, if you feel like if you sincerely feel like you hurt someone who is also happens to be a person who is like, you know, very violent and scary and like also severely hurt you, for example, which could very well be the case, right? It might not be remotely safe for you to like go seek out that person and ask for permission to make amends to them, right? And so there is a way in which like this also extends to cancel culture, right? Like maybe that person's not going to like beat the shit out of you or throw you through a wall or something, but they could destroy your life, right? If they're a dedicated canceller with a big platform. And so it might not be safe for you, like in a very real way, because we need our lives for you to make amends to them. So just bear that in mind. Now, you know, it also it might also be the case that you are just sort of like stuck in fear, and that fear isn't accurate or doesn't accurately reflect reality, and it's a good idea to check in with like a mentor or someone who you trust and try to like go through that with them, or like a therapist could be a good person too, to try to determine if you are in fact like safe if you were to make amends.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. It's important to remember that when we talk about the 12 steps, like we do all of this with someone, we don't do it alone. So I really, you know, even if you're not in a 12-step program, I really do think a therapist or someone trustworthy to like talk it through is really important. The other piece that I would just add is the concept of living amends, right? We don't always have the opportunity to make direct amends, but that does not mean that we cannot make things right to the best of our ability on our side of the street. So if it isn't safe for you to make a direct amends because that person is like actively dehumanizing you, you know, then what you can do is you can change your behavior in a consistent and ongoing way and make sure that you're not repeating the actions going forward in the future. And you never know, maybe in the future, that person will also have a change of heart in their behavior, and maybe opportunity for direct amends will open itself up. Sometimes that does happen. But you don't have to put your life on pause in the meantime.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I'm gonna take, if you have a question, I'm gonna say your name, just unmute yourself, ask your question. And there's only one follow-up question too, because we have to get to a few people. So Matthew, you had a question. If you want me to read it, just let me know.
No, that would be good. Thanks, Peter. My question is for Clementine and Jay. You talk about the phrase "the nexus," and I thought of the phrase after you mentioned polyamory, various sexual lifestyles, intimate lifestyles. A lot of people go to support groups for that. Also, substance abuse, people go to support groups for that, and it caused me to think about the phrase "the support group left." Because you had mentioned there were other groups that were more economically focused that couldn't really speak that language and weren't getting through to them. And I thought, what's the difference between these two groups on the left? And it seems like one of them has to do with perhaps support groups. That's what I wanted to find out from you, whether it's more like the online culture, even sometimes online fandoms, online support groups for this or that identity that are creating the nexus, or if it's more of like the political managerial class and the kind of person who works in human resources departments. But that's a very different class of people, I think. And perhaps the wine mom that Jay mentioned is part of that. And I don't know where those intersect to exclude, let's say, the dirtbag left, or exclude the more economically and systemically focused left. What do you think about that?
It's a big question. I definitely would not say that it is explicit to self-help groups or like support groups or anything like that. But I do generally appreciate that the nexus is a class politics of upwardly mobile people. And where I find this is that a lot of the language is coming out of university programs, social justice influenced university programs, but it isn't staying there because it is being spread through social media, right? So I think what confuses people when you hear critiques of like an analysis of the PMC, the professional managerial class, and the HR people and all of this is like, okay, but then why are like random why are like 19-year-old queers doing this, right? Well, it's because of social media. It's because there was a bunch of people in gender studies programs and in all of these types of upwardly mobile classed situations where they were learning a certain kind of language and a certain kind of way of relating, and then they all got onto at a certain time Tumblr and now Twitter and Instagram, and they started to share this knowledge and then police each other into sticking to it. I do agree that there is a certain element of the nexus that is very like navel gazing, that is very about looking at your own issues and your own trauma and all of this. Like I consider that to be a general feature. You agree with that?
Yeah.
Inside the nexus. So maybe that's kind of where the support group vibe is coming from. Because it is highly centered on like framing yourself and others through the lens of like victimization. But yeah, I don't know if that's a good answer.
Yeah, or like, there's definitely a component of the nexus that's really into like self-improvement. It's kind of, and which I find, I consider to be like a very neoliberal idea. It's part of the neoliberal zeitgeist, you could say, where it's sort of like, if we want to get rid of racism, like the thing we have to do is like look deep inside ourselves and like look at all the different ways that we're racist or something like that, instead of, dismantling the structural elements of society that reproduce racism, right? Or reproduce the negative effects of racism. And I think that pattern is repeated like throughout the social justice world, where it's really about these sort of like individual attempts to sort of like, become like what is considered like a better person through critiquing yourself and critiquing others, rather than sort of like trying to carry out any like material change in the real world.
Yeah, and Jay and I have long conversations about like where did the nexus exactly come from, and I don't know that we have a concrete answer to this, but I can say that in 2003, when I was in an alternative school for queer youth who had been driven out of the mainstream school system due to homophobia, I was learning nexus talking points then. And that was like very early on. And we were standing in a line and being like, if you're white, take a step forward. And if you're queer, take a step back. And like all of this, like this very identitarian way of thinking. And that was like in 2003. So it's been around for a while, and they were teaching it to me as a teenager. So I don't know, but hopefully that answer was somewhat helpful.
Thank you. I don't have a follow-up question, but I did want to say your podcast is great, and your talk today is really means a lot to me. So thanks very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Awesome. Thanks, Matthew. Evelyn, you had a question.
Yeah, I think I have two questions, and they might be related. One question is about when you were talking about the sort of like openness that people can give each other in a 12-step meeting context. Something that occurred to me that feels like it bubbled up as like the first like reaction is probably like, I suspect that there's some degree to which people's reactivity in like activist spaces comes from seeking safety, and the way that like using the right language or basically giving the right signals is an indication that a person's like aligning and aware of like maybe the like traumatic contexts of other people's experiences. But that brings me to, I think maybe what was like the second part, and it's like more of a question, is like, I recently heard this take, which is like that activism is like therapy, like functioning as therapy for a lot of people. And I think maybe this reminds me of the one perspective on online groups, which is that like people come into online groups, like the way incel culture formed, like people come into this space where they're getting support for not knowing how to interact with women, for example, or not know how to find a partner. And then the people who stay in that community are the people who just can't figure out how to solve it, and they become more and more reactionary. And the people who came to that community getting support eventually solved the problem for themselves or did some self-work and then figured out how to like, you know, move on. So I wonder if some of what's happening, like the way that the Nexus is being kind of piloted by, or like the engine of the Nexus being social media, is that like you have like a lot of very traumatized people, some of whom come in and then come out having worked through some traumatic history. Does that seem true to you? And then like, and then some of what's really powering the like rage in the Nexus is people who are sticking around, people who like are continually being re-traumatized by like engaging with this topic or something.
I have a thought. You know, to go. I mean, it's not exactly what you're saying, but I think one point that we make often about the Nexus is that it functions more like a religion than a politics. It functions more like a faith, and people make Nexus talking points like their orthodoxies, you know, and it doesn't matter if it doesn't really make sense. And in fact, to question it is to like kind of reveal yourself as a heretic, because how dare you even ask? Like, we know that this is true, you know? And I think that like a faith, it gives people this sense of like belonging, comfort, an ability to make sense of the world that is really like simple and straightforward. Yeah. So I think that like all of that is together. I do think that there are lots and lots of really traumatized people inside the Nexus who are having all sorts of nervous system responses. And I think that your analysis is definitely true, and that it's a piece of it. But what was actually shocking for me is realizing that there's actually lots of people inside the Nexus who are not that traumatized. And coming from as someone who has complex PTSD and my life has been literally insane, I just kind of walked around assuming that everybody else had these really violent experiences and they were equally like living with complex PTSD. And then, you know, as I got more like, you know, I did 10 years of therapy and got sober and did all of this and started to actually like listen to what people were saying. I'm like, actually, there's a lot of people who actually do not have these same types of experiences. And that's not to say that they don't have, you know, some level of bad shit going on. We're all living under capitalism. We're all experiencing like a lot of really fucked up dystopian shit right now. But not everybody is functioning here with PTSD. And I think that we sort of kind of generously offer that. And sometimes it's true, but also sometimes it's not. And I think that we also have to kind of account for that in our analysis, like what is going on for the many people who are also behaving in this way, who do not have an extensive history of trauma. So
yeah. I have a thought too, a bit disconnected from what Clementine just said, but you know, you were talking about safety and people wanting safety and you know, the kind of the like language that we use in these spaces being sort of like you know, a sign that tells you that you're safe if other people also know these kind of like these code words, right? And it's interesting, you know, because I compare it to 12 steps, where I feel like in general in 12-step groups, not perfectly by any means, but people are like quite safe in 12-step groups in the sense that they are like very accepted, you know, like there's pretty much nothing you can do like that will get you like, it's like really hard to get kicked out of a 12-step group, you know. I've seen it happen like one time just because some guy tried to hit another guy with a chair, you know. And like, yeah, I don't know. And on the other hand, like there's people who, yeah, like in these sort of social justice scenes are trying to seek out safety by seeking out people who can speak the same way that they do. But it's interesting, you know, because like, in fact, they're not safe in those spaces, right? And I noticed like one thing that Clementine and I have talked about a couple of times, like both of us are like extremely overeducated. We like spent like a million years in university for no good reason. And so like we have like, we're like really good at like words and language, right? And we like notice people sometimes who are like very woke, like very into these like social justice scenes and stuff, who are like using the terms wrong, because they're not educated the way that we are, you know? And I'm like, you are not going to last, sweetie, because you just said transgendered with a D at the end, you know?
Yeah.
And you're not allowed to say that. You haven't been allowed to say that since like 2016, you know? And the fact that you're saying it like marks you as someone who is not going to last in a subculture, you know, because it is not a subculture for marginalized people. It is a subculture for people who hold one or two marginalized identities who are upwardly mobile.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's super interesting. That's like the thing that comes up is that like that there's like really strong othering force in this world that it doesn't seem to be the case in a 12 step. Like it seems like this is the one main cultural difference just seems like intention or like reacting to feeling othered by othering others.
Thanks.
Awesome. Cynthia, you had a question.
All right. Yeah. Hello. Hi, big fan, big follower, everything. Well, this is a bit complex. Can you hear me well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, cool. It's a bit complex because like I'm I'm from Mexico and a lot of like things are going on mostly with femicides. There's like background of like women being murdered, trans people being murdered. It's one of the places with larger number of murder against people of and like that. And I've been trying, like, how would you navigate like trying to be more like anti-Nexon, like speaking about these things or just speaking about other things without following the current like overall radical feminist points of view that are being very, very common in the country of like men are trash, kill all men. And it's mostly like they're using men, they're seeing men as a scapegoat and saying that all men are bad. Like I've seen like married women with children in heterosexual marriages with three little boys and things like that, being like basically taking an original sin approach to like just saying that men are bad. And how do you say that not all men are bad, or just saying that, just trying to speak out again, like I don't know if you understand, without eventually being called like a pick me person or a machista or an enemy of women or
I mean, I
whatever.
think the first thing that you have to get comfortable with is that people are going to say all sorts of things about you. So I don't think that there's a way to sort of phrase things as much as we might like to in a way that can protect us from people attacking us or trying to like intentionally misrepresent what we're saying, you know, or having a big emotional response to what we're saying. So it sucks, but it's like, if we're going to step outside of the box, people are going to say things about us, and that's just kind of how it is. So that's the first piece. I think that the idea, you know, that like that shaming and like scapegoating a specific gender could respond to the serious situations that you're describing is just so absurd. Like, I think that people who think that like attacking men just generally is going to solve the kinds of really serious like violence that you're talking about, they need to defend their position, because I don't actually see like how that is an effective strategy for violence prevention, you know? In terms of like actual strategies for violence prevention and for like addressing like really severe violence, I think that a lot of these things are, in my opinion, like kind of socialist in the sense that like people need resources, right? Places where people are really not doing good are places where there tends to be a lot of violence. And so if we invest in communities and people actually have their needs met and people are not like struggling to survive, I think in general, that does have a large effect on impacting the amount of violence that goes on. Another thing is that people are super traumatized and they need support, right? And so if people actually had access, like one of the things that I say, you know, is I'm like, have we ever tried making comprehensive trauma therapy free and available to all? And if we were to to do that, like what impact would that have on the kinds of violence that we see like here and elsewhere, you know? And so those sort of are my two general approaches, is that one, people need like food, they need security, they need like a place to live. You know, they need to not have to fight for those things and struggle in poverty. And then they also need like support for their full complex humanity and to actually heal from the traumas that they have experienced and that their parents have experienced and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
And so like the actual answer is a lot harder because it's like, it involves like, how are we going to do that? How are we going to get people's needs met, right? And it actually kind of requires an organized left to actually do that, which we don't have.
Exactly. And like, you know, canceling a guy who sets women on fire
It's absurd.
is not going to do anything, right? It's like it's like an absurdity. So cancel culture doesn't help with that, but it does impede our ability to build like a functional left, right?
And it also makes us feel like we're doing something when we're not, right? And I think that that's like one of the dangerous things. It's like being really mad about it and being like, fuck man, is like, that's not doing anything, you know? And as like a domestic violence survivor, I always just think about how laughable it is as a strategy for like real domestic violence. Because if I were to like put my ex-partner when he was stalking me like on blast on the internet, that would like 100% just put me in further risk of danger. You know, it's like not actually something that would keep me safe. And so I don't think it's a useful tool. It does impede our ability to organize, and we have to organize if we're actually going to address like these serious social problems that people are facing.
Definitely. Yeah, and also that thing of putting people on blast is like the favorite technique right now of like people sharing on Facebook like my ex is abusive, and what they mean with abusive is he cheated on her, or like just turning like the tiniest like maybe they weren't meant for each other and they had a bad time, but now he's not allowed to find someone better because it didn't work with those people.
Yeah, and I think that what you're describing is a very current, like major part of cancel culture right now, is actually like what I'm starting to describe as an appropriation, like appropriating the language of domestic violence and like actual serious shit and applying it to interpersonal conflict to lend an emotional weight to it. And that this actually takes away from our ability to take actual domestic violence and like really serious shit, like you were just talking about, like seriously, and to actually have a movement that is about ending gendered violence. Because now the discourse around gendered violence is being totally taken over by people who are using that discourse to like cancel their ex for literally just interpersonal stuff. So that's my spicy hot take for now.
Thanks very much.
Do you two have a hard stop at the top of the hour? Could you field a couple more questions?
Oh yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, that's fine.
Cool. Laura, you had a question.
I was typing that question for Brian, but I think I did a really bad job, so I'll just let him ask it.
All right, I'll try to make this make sense. So I'm also in AA, and my wife was canceled this year, and so I have seen folks in my own meetings who have actively contributed to her cancellation and yet stand up and are, you know, kind of applauded for being pillars within at least like the Baltimore AA scene. And I kind of have a real problem with that, especially with the whole idea of principles before personalities. As you were saying before about how, you know, those of us in recovery are in rooms or have ourselves done some real serious shit, and have used these programs to kind of come back and readapt our humanity. And so, you know, in my home group, you know, we speak for the full hour. And so I've been having a real hard time with, do I address this as part of the meeting? You know, obviously not call out individuals, but kind of address it as a whole with what I'm seeing. And if so, how to go about that?
So yes, the cancel culture stuff leaking into 12-step world is absolutely heartbreaking to me. It is really fucking disturbing to me.
Yeah.
It completely goes against the primary purpose, because if you are showing, and for people who don't know, the primary purpose is to carry the message to the alcoholic who still suffers. But basically what that means is that if you are shaming people, excluding people, judging people, especially for some random nonsense, you know? How is the person who has just done an armed robbery supposed to feel like they are going to be welcome and safe in this space to actually do the work that they need to do to heal? So absolutely counter to everything that 12 steps is supposed to stand for. Unfortunately, it's becoming more and more of a thing. When I was canceled, I was very anxious to talk about cancel culture in any way in meetings. And it was a very weird phenomenon for me because at the time meetings were all online because of COVID. And so I was going to these sort of like international meetings, but I'm kind of like internationally known. So I was kind of freaked out because I was like, if I share about this, are people going to like know who I am? And like, I felt weird about it, you know? But I really needed to talk about what was going on for me. So I did talk about it and I named cancel culture in the meeting. I am one of the types that's like, if an outside issue is affecting your sobriety, I think that it should be welcome at the meeting to talk about it in relationship with the steps and your recovery. So I talked about it. And what ended up happening is that a lot of addicts reached out to me talking about their own fears and their own experiences. And we're really grateful that I was that transparent and honest. So I do think that it has a space in the rooms to openly talk about cancel culture as a phenomenon. My personal advice would be to keep it general, you know, and to sort of talk about this as a larger phenomenon that is affecting lots of people, and the way that you think that it is contrary to the primary purpose and to the principles, and also to like kind of invite that people who are thinking about this stuff could talk to you about it, you know?
Yeah.
That would be my advice.
Yeah. And here's some fucking lines from the big book. We are not saints.
Mhm.
Fucking none of us, right?
Love and tolerance of others is our code.
And also we do not crawl, right? Like we're not
Yeah.
we're not better than you, we're not worse than you.
Yeah.
And no one is, you know. So it's like it just goes completely against the fucking primary purpose. It goes against all the principles.
So much, yeah.
It's nonsense, you know. And I think that it's like totally fine to talk about that very directly in a meeting.
And be a booker about it. Just like
Yeah, throw the book at them.
pull
man.
out your book. Anyway,
Yeah.
so that's our thoughts. Love to talk to other 12 steppers.
Any follow-up question or share? No?
No, but thanks so much. That's definitely a lot of good food for thought.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Kevin, you had a question.
Hey y'all. I'm wondering, this has been really great so far, I just want to say. I'm wondering how your experience in the 12-step program affects your views and your relationships with folks on the right. I see you have a pod about right-wing populism. I'm wondering like how like the kind of 12-step mentality has affected your view or your relationship with like your political enemies, so to speak.
Yeah, I can speak to that for sure. Like, I definitely feel before I came into the program, and even like to a certain extent, like in my first like couple years in the program, like, you know, I really considered anyone on the right to be like really like an enemy, you know, but it becomes hard to keep that up. You know, it really does. It's first of all, it's exhausting. Second of all, you know, you start to realize over time that like people who believe very different things from you can act in ways that are extremely humanizing and, you know, with a lot of compassion and so on and so forth. And like, those are things that I care about a lot. They're important principles to me, you know? So if I see somebody who's, you know, some like right-wing Christian who believes things that are very different from what I believe, but is acting in a way that like, you know, is in line with my principles, then I'm like, this guy is all right, you know, like whatever, like it doesn't really, like, it's not that it doesn't matter what he believes, but like, you know, I've changed my beliefs before, like maybe he's going to change his, maybe I'll change mine, you know, what, like whatever. I also think that like the larger like political project of socialism requires that people who are currently, you know, positioned somewhere on the right become supporters of a socialist, you know, government. Like that, it needs that. Like we need that if we're ever going to have a socialist state in Canada, which is what I want. That is my goal, you know, as a socialist. And so in order for that, like either that or we fucking like put them on gulags, right? Which is not the kind of socialism I'm about, right? And so, you know, people need to be won over to a certain degree. And also some of their ideas might need to be integrated into what we're doing, right? If we're going to have like a state that works for everyone that lives within it.
I think we've talked about people, conservatives and people on the right a few times on the podcast. But basically, yeah, like principles before personalities, you know, and and being able to find what is shared, you know, what are the shared values that you do have? Because I think we're so often encouraged to look at the people on the right as like caricatures, like evil caricatures. But if you actually talk to people and you actually ask them like what's important to them, at the end of the day, I think a lot of people, we care about similar things, you know, and they might be phrasing that in a different way, you know, but they care about, I don't know, like family values or something. But like, what is family values about? You know, it's about loving community and being connected to people. And I care about that too. So maybe there's a way in which we could find common ground. I also think that there's they talk about on the Jacobin show, they talk about how it's like shown that like unions and like working together, it is actively erodes bigotry, right? Because it's very hard to be a bigot when there's a real person in front of you. It's a lot harder to believe in a weird, like stereotypical story about someone when you see a three-dimensional person that you're like sharing goals with and working together with, right? And 12 Steps functions that way too, because it's like we're sharing space, we're sharing vulnerability, we're actually getting to know each other as people. And so I think like relationships, like if someone is homophobic or something like that, but then they like know me and they're like, oh, Clementine's so lovely, you know, she always puts the chairs out and like she's very friendly and always asks me how I'm doing. But then turns out I'm a big queer. Well, maybe that is going to start chipping away at her beliefs about what queers are like, you know, and maybe that's how we start to move towards more solidarity across difference.
Yeah, thank you. Great response. Quick follow-up. So if we were to elaborate, or if we were to continue on this line of thought, so like the Nexus people, they have, you know, they have been in the same space as you, right? They have related to you, but they still have that type of like weird, whether it's an ideological thing or a trauma type thing that like causes them to cancel you. I'm wondering, like, if there's some, you said you could relate to people on the right if they share similar principles, but I'm wondering like what the bad thing like the Nexus might be on the right, like, you know, that makes someone like a Nazi, or right, like I'm wondering if, does that make sense?
I don't
No.
understand.
Like, I'm not sure if I'm actually getting your question, but
Okay.
I think part of what happens with cancellation is that it's a dehumanization and it's a lack of empathy. And you will notice that part of what happens with the dehumanization and the lack of empathy is that you're not allowed to have a relationship with that person anymore. Because maybe if you did have a relationship with that person, it would be harder to dehumanize them, right? Like the two things kind of go hand in hand, where we like push someone out and then we dehumanize them together. So that's sort of like part of why I think people are still able to dehumanize, even though they might know someone. It's like they cut off the empathy and then they push them away so that they don't have to be reminded that this is the full person that you used to know. And instead they substitute like a caricature for it. But like, are you asking like who in the Nexus has gone too far or something like that?
Or I'm asking, I'm like, if like doing boundary work on like, you know, people on the right say that you could agree with or align principles with, right? Like where are you drawing a boundary to people that you wouldn't, or like,
So
you know,
basically, like for me, it's like, you know, my door is always open, but my boundary is that you have to treat other people with basic human decency and consideration and respect. And I think that goes to the left or to the right. You know, if somebody was saying openly homophobic things to me, I would be like, I'm not having that conversation. Like, you know, similarly, if somebody's talking some cancel shit about somebody and trying to dehumanize them to me, I'm going to say, I'm not having that conversation. You know, like I don't actually sit around letting people dehumanize others in front of me, regardless of your justification for that, you know, but that doesn't mean that I permanently mark these people as like they can never change. You know, I encourage them to like engage with like my ideas that I'm putting out here about this stuff. And if they are curious and they want to have like a conversation about it instead of being condemning, then I'm willing to talk to them about it, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not saying that like the left should sort of like directly work with neo-Nazis or something, not that that would ever even be possible, right? Like, but that being said, you know, there are some people on the sort of populist right that are kind of rubbing shoulders with certain like alt-right types or whatever, who, you know, there's no particular reason why like a series of reasoned arguments and like a friendship couldn't like make them, you know, kind of change their ideas about certain things. You know, a lot of people who get sucked into you know, radical right-wing politics are, to put it, you know, politely, like not particularly politically sophisticated, and they just kind of fall down like a YouTube rabbit hole, you know. And like it's really easy. Well, I won't say it's easy. It is possible to redirect certain forms of populist rage simply by being like, you know, like, what is the like motivation for like the elite to like kill everyone with COVID vaccines or something? And it makes no fucking sense. But there is a motivation for the elite to sort of like, for example, have like privatized COVID vaccines and make sure that we have to buy them from private American corporations and not produce them ourselves in generic versions in factories in Canada that we used to have, but then we sold in the fucking 80s with the wave of neoliberalization, right? So like that is like a way that you can sort of be like, yes, the elite's bad, a thing. You know what I mean? Anyways.
And I feel like we can do a similar thing with Nexus, where it's like, the actual impulse to be against, systems of oppression is a good one. We agree on that. It's just a matter of, is your behavior, are your actions in line with what you're saying you believe? Because if you say you believe, like a basic, if you are against dehumanization, if you are against the idea that people should be treated so badly, well, who does that extend to and who does it not extend to, right? And if you're acting in ways that are dehumanizing and cruel and othering all the time, but you say that you're for like, treating all people as equals, it's a contradiction. So I think that there's a way of connecting people with their own values and their own principles that kind of will lead them away from this kind of behavior. And I think that's true on the left and the right.
Thanks, Kevin. So we'll sneak in one more question. Alex, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I know I asked mine a little bit on the later side, but what do you think the impact of cancel culture, whatever you want to call it, has been on political organizing? I've been adjacent to a lot of leftist groups in Southern Ontario, Toronto area, and a lot of them, it's almost like it's like countdown to implosion over like
Yes.
interpersonal conflicts or groups focusing on campaigns that have nil or sometimes zero to do with uplifting like marginalized working class people on like a broader basis. So like I guess sometimes I just get confused because like these people almost get stuck in relationships with each other. So I'm like, why aren't they working? Why isn't there more like products of like their labor? Because they're always I just assume they would be working for something, honestly.
Right. Yeah, so I think that there's two like clear impacts that the Nexus has on left-wing organizing. One, the Nexus tries to turn everything into the Nexus, So basically it means that like if there's any kind of like organizing taking place, people from the Nexus will try to like get in there and make it be more like the Nexus, So if people are trying to organize on the basis of class, for example, that will be nuked from orbit immediately. It doesn't vibe with the Nexus, right? You have to make it about identity and preferably about like ascriptive identity, like gender, race, and so on. So that's like number one. It kind of like forces everything into this kind of like neoliberal identitarian kind of frame. Number two is that within any organizations on the left that are like infected with this stuff, which at this point is basically all of them, cancellations occur with frightening regularity, and they knock down like people in positions of leadership. They also are used by people in positions of leadership to get rid of competition. Different factions within organizations will use cancel culture as a way to like get rid of each other. Because we get emails from canceled people like daily, like constantly, right? And so we've heard a lot of these stories, right? And so it's like every single like big leftist organization and small leftist organization that you can think of from top to bottom has been impacted by this, from the IWW to the DSA to like Earth First to Extinction Rebellion got like fucking nuked. Extinction Rebellion is toast because of cancellation stuff. And yeah, I mean, there's, it's very clear that this is happening kind of like organically because of the influence of the Nexus. It's also clear that it is a very, very easy tool for the police to use, right? Like, and there's been many cases of this as well. Yeah.
And so I think, I'm glad that you asked this as a kind of like a last question or whatever, because it's very close to my heart. I think it's extremely important because we are in a bad situation. We have climate change going on. We really need to do something, and we can't fucking do anything because our orgs are constantly exploding before they can do anything, And so one of the main things that I want to say about this is that there is no way out but through. we cannot avoid being canceled. I think so many people are like, I'm just going to put my head down and hope it doesn't happen to me. I hope it doesn't happen to my org. But guess what? It is going to. And so we actually have to face it head on. And so what I really want to encourage is for organizers, because like we joke that there's like, you know, the first rule of cancel culture is you can't talk about cancel culture, right? So like anyone who says, hey, we don't want cancel culture to be affecting our org is going to get canceled for saying that, because immediately people are going to be like, that's a right-wing dog whistle, you know? But we as leftists, we know that this is a real phenomenon. We're very aware of it. It's happening all around us constantly. And we as leftists need to care about our political work and our political projects. And we need to protect ourselves from what we call wreckerism, which is when cancel culture is directed at an organization to implode it from the inside. And so basically, currently, one of the things that Jay and I are kind of doing is like offering to speak to any leftist org that wants us to come and talk to them about cancel culture and wreckerism for free, just so we can help people to kind of shake off the fear factor of talking about this stuff, get some ideas about how the org might strategize for protecting itself against the inevitable callouts that are definitely coming. And also, you know, one thing I'm particularly interested in is internal policy building about this stuff, and how could orgs ahead of time, before they're canceled, preferably, build into their organization some kind of thing that both acknowledges that cancel culture exists and that has like some kind of response built in for what they're going to do when this happens, instead of everybody just throwing up their hands and letting the thing explode. So really important. And I'm glad you asked. And I hope that we all start talking about this more, because we need to deal with climate change.
Yeah.
Very true. Thanks for answering my questions, guys.
Thanks for asking.
Thanks, Alex. So we'll gently close here. Any parting words you'd like to leave us with here at the Stoa? Perhaps something that's like making you come alive, excited about with the podcast or otherwise?
Well, I will say that it's been really interesting seeing this unfold over the past, how long have we been doing this podcast? Like almost 2 years.
Almost 2 years.
Going from like a very small and extremely kind of hated little nugget to, you know, something that's picking up a lot of steam. A lot of people are like constantly getting in touch to say that they're like really happy that we're doing this work and stuff, which is like really nice to hear, because a lot of people also are not happy that we're doing this work, you know. But yeah, like, you know, people have been reaching out, trying to get us to do talks like to the organization, as Clementine has mentioned, like, and we're happy to do that. And yeah, I mean, a lot of the time it's like people who are like, I got involved in like environmentalism because I really care about like the old growth forest or something. And yet like, it's impossible to do anything because our organizations are constantly falling apart. Like, what do we do about this? And it's a really important question, but I'm really happy that more and more people are starting to become aware that like, this is an issue that is like existential actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's like, it sounds almost ridiculous to say that cancel culture is an existential threat, but like when you look at the stakes, which are extremely high in my opinion, especially with regard to climate change, but also with regard to the way that like the capitalist economy is like circling the drain, like it's like really fucked, you know, like we're in bad fucking shape. And it has to be, we need to have like a strong and functional socialist left. This is my opinion. And the fact that we cannot fucking build that because of cancel culture means that like cancel culture has become an existential threat.
Agree.
I don't know if that's an uplifting message.
I will try and put more uplifting. So my parting words is to be brave. I think that no matter what, when we start talking about this stuff, it is scary. I think that, you know, various people here are canceled probably. There's others who are canceled adjacent, as I like to call them, who are starting to talk about this stuff, but who are really scared about talking about it publicly because they're worried it's going to happen. I just want to say that Jay and I know that there are so many of us. Like Jay said, we are receiving messages every day, you know, just the sheer number of canceled people is staggering.
It's fucking crazy.
It's staggering. Okay. And then also the number of people who are like, I don't like this anymore, I want out is really, 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 really high. And so you may feel alone because of the fact that people are so scared to publicly talk about this, but you're not. And the more that we become brave and begin to have these conversations and begin to open things up a little bit more, and to be able to say, like, we want to be able to think and speak freely and have associations with each other and be able to revive the left and to do all of these things that are so important, we need to be able to do so without fearing our friends and our communities. And so we have to stand up against cancel culture directly. And how we're all going to do that is going to look different from person to person. But I really encourage each of us in our own small ways to try to find the courage to start doing that. And one of the upsides is that you meet a lot of really lovely people along the way. And when you meet people whose politics are invested in opposing dehumanization in whatever form it takes, and who believe that no one is disposable, you will find true, trustworthy friends who will be there with you for the long haul. And so it's worth it. Even though you'll lose a lot, you'll also gain so much more. That's my uplifting thought.
Thank you, Clementine.
Awesome. Well said. And yeah, definitely check out the fucking canceled podcast. It's really good. I'll put it on the video description. And if there were some questions we didn't get to, so if you can save the chat with the 3 little dots right there if you want to read them on your leisure. And I'll make some closing announcement in a moment. But Clementine, Jay, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today. It was a wonderful conversation. If you want to check out more sessions of the Stoa, you go to thestoa.ca. We have Timothy Morton coming to the Stoa, who wrote this excellent book called Hyperobjects. Now that I think about it, cancel culture is a hyperobject, so this might help understand the critique of this.
Yeah, the Nexus has a hyperobject. Sick.
Cool. So Clementine, Jay, everyone, thank you so much for coming to Stoa today.
Thanks for having
man.
us.
Thanks.